Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first Global Community of Practice webinar. My name is Marlena Centeno, and I'll be your host during this time. I'm here with Dr. Phil Monroe, and we're excited to have you. I don't know if you knew this, but you are one of more than 14,000 facilitators from all around the world joining this call and have gone through our program. And we just want to say thank you. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy, busy schedules to join us to learn more about what's happening in trauma healing. We heard you. We know that you said that you wanted to be connected to what's happening. You got trained, you've done a couple healing groups, and now what to do now, what to do next. And so we hope that this webinar and a couple other ways we're going to talk about later on can help you stay connected. Your church leaders, your facilitators, your organizational leaders. And so again, thank you so much for joining us. You're not alone. And before we get started into the webinar, I want to go over a couple technological questions that you might have. This is going to be an interactive webinar. We want to hear from you. We want to see you. We want to know where you're calling from. But in order for us to interact with you, we have to make sure that your tech is set up on your end. In Zoom, what you'll see that slide up on the screen there. We want to make sure that you can use your chat feature. So if you want to go ahead and in the chat feature, you'll see something that says to, like where to send your chat to. Make sure that it's that the panelists and attendees is who you're sending it to, because we want everybody to be able to see this. So you can unclick the panelist and click to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see what's happening and we can hear from you. In fact, why don't you go ahead now and type in your name and where you're calling from so that we can say hello. So let's check out that chat feature. Your name and where you're calling from so that we can say hi to you. Like I said, today with me is Dr. Phil Monroe. He leads the trauma healing program at American Bible Society, and he'll be interviewing Nancy Writebol, who is the Global Trauma Healing Coordinator for SIM International. So before I pass the mic over to Dr. Phil to interview Nancy, again, we want to say hi. So we've got Gabriella from El Salvador, Janice from South Carolina. We've got Jerry from Liberia, Bible Society in Liberia. Perry calling from the Philippines. Hi, Perry. It's so nice to see you here. We're really excited, again, for all of you guys. So keep using the chat feature so that we can make sure that we stay engaged. Keep saying hello. Keep seeing friends and saying hi to them as well. Another big thing is, again, this is participatory. We want to hear from you. Make sure that you, throughout the program, type in your questions. You might have some questions for Dr. Phil. You might have a question for Nancy, something that you heard sparked your interest or you want to respond to. Go ahead and type those questions into the chat feature so that we can make sure that we get those questions answered before the end of the broadcast. So I'm going to go ahead and transition that over to Dr. Phil so that he can go ahead and introduce Nancy for you.
Well, thank you, Marlena. And it is amazing that we have a technology that allows us to connect our 14,000, the four corners of the world, to talk together and connect together around trauma healing and encourage each other. And so today I'm really excited to bring Nancy Writebol, who, as you said, is the Trauma Healing Coordinator for SIM International, and she resides in Liberia, and she's been there for a few years and is part of our Trauma Healing Alliance. And so if you've been to a global COP, you might have seen her or seen one of our videos, but we wanted to talk to her a little bit about her experience with trauma healing and the fact that she kind of made the news a few years ago when during the Ebola crisis, she became part of the crisis. So welcome, Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi, how are you guys? It's great to be with you today. And around the world, it's great to be with everyone.
Yes, isn't this amazing? We're grateful for this technology, and we pray over it that it works well for us here. So Nancy, I'd like to start with the first question by just having you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be in Liberia in 2013.
Well, thank you, Phil. We did come to Liberia in 2013, came in with SIM way before the Ebola crisis hit West Africa, and came in to do a different position. I was the SIM personnel coordinator, and so my husband was the technical services advisor. So we came in to serve in support areas for SIM. And then in December of 2013, you began to hear about the Ebola crisis that was in Guinea, and moved from Guinea down to Monrovia in 2014. And so we had our first case in June of 2014.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, you had some missionary experience in other parts of the world as well. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that too.
That's true. We have now been on the field 21 years, and we started out in Ecuador. So buenos dias para mis amigos. Where we are so glad to have spent 5 years in Ecuador, and then we moved to Zambia in Africa, of course, and spent the next 8 years in Zambia. Left Zambia, and we're in the States for about 9 months before we came to Liberia. So have been on the field for about 21 years.
Great. Great. So you and David come to Liberia. It's 2013. You move into 2014, as you started to say. You came for one purpose, but of course, after that purpose, you ended up having to deal with the crisis of Ebola, and then became part of the news. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Well, we did have our hospital begin to be prepared for the Ebola crisis in case it came to our hospital. And so we started about March or April preparing for that. And then, as I said, in June, our first case came, and I had been asked to step in and to be a hygienist and to help doctors and nurses don and doff their personal protective equipment before they went into the unit. And then when they came out of the unit, I did a decontamination for them. So got involved in that way, was not ever really in a potentially dangerous area, was not in the unit myself. But then we had, I trained a Liberian young man to do the same job I was doing. And he came several days, very sick, but not telling any of us. He was taking different kinds of medication, and it was masking the symptoms. And so we didn't really pick up, and he didn't really tell us that he wasn't feeling too great. So had contact with him. And then the day that I stepped out because I wasn't feeling well, he didn't show up for work that night. And that was on a Tuesday, and then later that week, he came in and he was full-fledged with Ebola and died shortly after that. So Dr. Brantley and I were both tested and confirmed on the same day, and there began the journey. I guess, the journey really began as we were taking care of patients and helping doctors and nurses go in and out of the unit. And just, there was never just a real fear of it. There was a healthy respect, but not so much a fear. And then I think when Kent and I both received the word that we had been confirmed as Ebola patients, it took on a different meaning. And I think for me, it was heartbreaking because Kent and I were colleagues, and he's the age of our sons, and their children were the age of our grandchildren. And we had seen so little survival rate that both knew what the outcome of the crisis.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. You are coming there to help, and I imagine you're having the experience of all of a sudden, I now need to be helped, but I also know what happens with this particular disease, both for yourself, for Dr. Brantley, who you're mentioning as well, the other American doctor as well. We want to ask you a few more questions, but I want to give Marlena an opportunity to reintroduce you and to remind the viewers what they can do to chat.
Yeah, for those of you that are just joining, I know a bunch of you just joined. We want to say welcome again for joining us. This is the very first Global Community of Practice webinar. We'll be doing a few of these throughout the year, but this is our very first, so we're very excited. I have Dr. Phil Monroe here with me, who is the leader of the Trauma Healing Program for the American Bible Society, and I have Nancy Writebol, who is talking about how she survived being a survivor of Ebola, and she is also the Global Trauma Healing Coordinator for SIM International. And I shared earlier that this is an interactive call. We want to hear from you. We want to know your name, where you're calling from, and we also want to hear your questions or even just comments about what's happening here. So if you're just joining us, go ahead and put your name and where you're calling from. But then also, if you've been with us for the entire time or you just joined us and you have a question for either Nancy or Phil, you can go ahead and type that in too. So let's get started.
So Nancy, you know this is coming because in our trauma healing materials, we talk about good listening, and one of our questions that we like to ask is, what was the hardest part? So for you, going through becoming infected with Ebola and the recovery, tell us, what was the hardest part for you?
Well, I think there were several difficult issues that we went through. First of all, there's a helplessness when you are working with patients and that you don't feel like there's anything you can do to help them. You're doing everything that you can, and yet you know that the rate of survival is so little that you just feel this helplessness. And then I think one of the other things was just watching one of your colleagues also contract Ebola, and knowing that he's young, he's a brilliant doctor, and he has a family. Seeing that, and then hearing and walking with the librarians as we walked through it, and as patients died of Ebola, and seeing their families and responding and trying to give some level of comfort, that was difficult. I think personally, one of the hardest parts for me was the night I was evacuated. When they put me on that airplane, there was the chance that I might not even survive the flight. But saying goodbye to my husband was probably the most difficult thing, and not knowing what lay ahead. All of those things were really difficult. But I will tell you, God's grace and his strength were amazing that whole time. And there were times when the Lord was just so there and so real that it was almost like you could reach out and touch.
Wow.
And I'm so thankful for that dark period of time, because it gave me such assurance of being his daughter, and that nothing could separate me or take me out of his hand. And that was an encouragement. I mean, one night, the Lord just gave me John 10 because I was really struggling, and he just brought that scripture right to mind, and where he says in John 10:27, nothing can separate us. Nothing can take you out of my hand. Nothing can take you out of the Father's hand.
Wow.
And so there was just this great sense of his presence during the whole thing.
Yeah. That's amazing. We're really thankful that you did survive to tell us this, but to feel God's presence and kindness even in the midst of what probably was terrible isolation, literal isolation, because you were kept away from other folks. I'm thinking too, because you have survived and you continue in ministry and trauma healing, that you can probably see ways now, especially, that you might not have seen before, about how God has used your infection and recovery. So tell us a little bit about how God has been able to use this part of your story.
Crisis, SIM was responding to the crisis by SIM was sending finances to help during that. And then we received a letter from one of the pastors here, and he sent a letter to Stacy if there was someone that they could send that could help to deal with the trauma that people were carrying, the pain that they were walking through. Because Liberia has not only been through the Ebola crisis, but they had been through 14 years of civil war. And so here they are going through 14 years of civil war, rebuilding process, just when they thought that, things were starting to really turn around, and Ebola hit, and it threw them back so many years. So bringing trauma healing, having the privilege of coming back to Liberia. When we first came back to Liberia, I continued to work at the hospital, and I was in our survivors clinic. One of our doctors had started a survivors clinic, and so I was part of that and got to meet with patients before they saw the doctor, did vitals on them, took information, and then was able to ask them, what is it? Tell us your story about you going through the Ebola crisis, and how are you dealing with it? And it was interesting because they would share a little, and then I would ask them as they shared some if they recognized my name or who I was, because I had been at the hospital anyway, and they'd say, oh, we remember that you were here before, or we've seen you before, and some people would say, I've seen you, but I can't remember where you're from. And I that had been working here in Liberia at our hospital, the ELWA hospital. And immediately there was this recognition that I knew what they were talking about. And it was like you could see this wall come down between.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people would share and pour out to be able to have been trained in trauma healing and to be able to just listen to their story.
Wow.
And I think that, that's one of the keys with trauma healing, is listening to people's story and to their pain. Yeah. And I really do count it a privilege to be able to be a part of trauma healing and to have brought it and to invite people then into healing groups. But we quickly found out when people were in healing groups that it wasn't just Ebola that they were dealing with. All of a sudden, all of the layers of the war and the atrocities of war that had gone on were starting to peel off. Yeah. And so, as I said, we just thank God for the privilege of being here. And would I wish going through Ebola on anyone? No. But God has used it in amazing ways, and we've seen him at in it.
Yeah. Thank you for telling us that part. Especially, I want to highlight that because trauma is a disconnecting, isolating kind of problem, whether it's domestic abuse or a disease where you feel so different and apart from everyone. And your ability to be able to talk to people who have also survived, and I think you've said before, have been places like where they're the only family member, they've lost everyone, and here is someone who can understand at least a good portion of what they've gone through as far as the experience of the disease.
Right.
And I can imagine that does dissolve walls because, oh, you get it. You know that experience, even if you don't know it quite the way that they went through it. So that's just amazing.
Yeah.
Marlena, maybe you want to give us again, our audience is keeping growing,
Yeah.
so maybe you can tell them again what they need to do. And
Yeah. I appreciate what you said about us. The walls come down when you recognize that somebody has the same story as you. And there's so many people on this call right now that have so many different experiences and stories. But what does connect us is the work of trauma healing. And a few of you that are on right now are David from Rwanda. Thank you so much, David, for doing the work that you're doing in Rwanda. Nahal Silva from Sri Lanka, Sarah in Bolivia, Roxana from El Salvador, Reina in Bahrain, Kathy in North Dakota and United States, Steve in Malawi, Mayday in Nigeria, Boutrous in South Sudan, Ruthie in Oregon. Thank you so much for joining us on this call, but more importantly, for doing the work of healing wounded hearts. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh, and Jewel in Bangladesh. I wanted to make sure that I say hi to Jewel. Hi, Jewel. Thanks for joining us.
So, Nancy, as 6 years have passed or so since the crisis in Liberia, for those of us who aren't there, it can kind of go out of sight, out of mind. We don't think about it anymore. We don't think about the repercussions. But we know that oftentimes people who live in those situations continue to experience. Can you tell us a little bit about how it might impact librarians today?
Well, I think as we look at the viruses that are around the world, even the virus in China right now,
Right.
Just recently, one of our public health officials came on to the newspaper and in the news and said that Liberia was preparing for the virus in case it spread to Liberia, because we have so many people that come and go from China here with goods and with import that it's a real concern that that we might have another crisis and not be able to handle that again. So people are on the alert, and it's not just a virus that comes from a different country. I mean, we are dealing right now with Lassa fever. And Lassa fever, this is the season, the highest season for it. And this year we have seen more Lassa fever cases than before. And so people are on the alert, okay? So that's one of the things we look for when we are dealing with trauma, is how people are responding to what they are going through. We've been going through an economic crisis, and now we're in a fuel crisis. And people are on edge and on alert because of what they're dealing with. But I think what's really great about trauma healing is the resilience that it builds within people. And I will say that when I look at librarians many times, I say they are very resilient people because of what they have gone through and what they have survived. But trauma healing builds that in people. And so as we walk through that with them, it's just great to be able to point to tools that we can say, when the next thing happens in your life, you'll be able to stand up because you have these tools in which you've had before, and you'll know how to respond. You'll know that you can lament when a crisis comes. You'll know that you're grieving when you're feeling some of the symptoms that you are. But it's not it's not just Liberia, it's all over the world, Phil.
Right.
Right.
Every time I hear and think about what's happening in the DRC, and for our brothers and sisters that are there that are in an Ebola crisis and have come through war, and I was in Goma in October, and to see that they've been through even a volcano that destroyed their city.
Right.
The traumas around the world are different,
Yeah.
but the reactions and the way that people respond are many times the same. And
That's right.
I think one of the things that Diane Langberg has really helped me to think about is that truly trauma is probably the mission field of the 21st century. If we will only open our eyes and look for what is happening around us, and then to take the time to listen to people and to really care for them and what they're going through.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's so many layers of trauma that can be hidden, and when we get involved and start working with folks and listening and creating safe spaces, we start finding them and also seeing their resilience and their strength in the process as well. So I think this makes a good pivot point to start talking about the work that you're continuing to do, and not just you as part of the story, right? So you are the Trauma Healing Coordinator for SIM International. That means you're overseeing the trauma healing activities that SIM is doing around the world. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the stories of what's going on within SIM in trauma healing in various places. Give us some successes and what activities you're involved in.
Well, it's really, it isn't just a one-person thing. I mean, there are many people involved in trauma healing with SIM, and I am so grateful for all of those people. We have a coordinator in East Africa. We have a coordinator in North Africa and in the Middle East, and I'm excited about what's happening in the Middle East with trauma healing, and to see people that they're really struggling with all that's going on, with all the persecution, and to be a Christian, to stand up and be a Christian, and to know that your life is really on the line. So to be able to present trauma healing in our Middle East countries, in our Latin America countries, we are grateful to have a coordinator in Latin America, and we are looking at how God may use us even in Asia this next year. So, but it takes many people. It can't just be one person. It takes facilitators to do healing groups, and then facilitators to mentor others and to train others so that it can multiply itself. We don't live in a silo, and we don't want to stay in that silo either. So we're thankful. We have a children's program even here in Liberia, and I'll tell you a success story about one of our children. We had this little girl that was coming, and one day the teacher, the very first lesson in the children's material is about that you are special to God. And so the teacher was sharing this story about how special the children were and how God had created them. And the little girl, she went, "Oh," and the teacher said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "I didn't know that. I didn't know I was special." And then she looked at the teacher and she said, "I didn't know God created me." And she said, "Nobody ever told me this."
Oh.
And as the week went on, it was just beautiful to watch this little girl walk through that trauma healing week, and to see her loved on and be able to share where she had come from. And so we love our children's program. We're so thankful for it. And this year we hope to present, or we're planning on beginning our oral story part of trauma healing for those people that want to share in story based trauma healing. So we're going to be training that way this year, and we look forward to even implementing the teen program possibly later. So there's so much going on in trauma healing. Where do you stop? And it's a blessing to be a part of it. So the new material, Strength from Weakness, that is the second book that's come out from trauma healing. We will be piloting it, and so thankful to have it and so many other benefits to what we're doing. So it's great. It's really great. It's a passion.
Yes, it definitely comes through the screen. We can see that. And for those of you who might not know, Strength from Weakness is a new set of lessons that have been built by a team that was working on for the question of when you are in a healing group and you've done all the lessons and you want to keep meeting because you've really bonded together and you want to say, but what's next? Well, these are lessons that are what's next. So not long ago, a group of people met in Philadelphia, and we got to experience those lessons, and part of our job now, and Nancy was part of those, is to bring them to various parts of the world and try them out in a pilot to test them before they're final published. So that's something that you might be able to see before the end of the year, some published in a variety of languages. I think they're in French and Spanish and Kinyarwandan and Russian and, of course, English. But there may be some other ones being translated as well. So that's that particular set of materials.
And it sounds like there's a lot of great connecting and networking happening in the chat, so keep going. If you have questions, don't forget to submit your questions, but keep doing what you're doing. You guys are connecting. That's what this call is for. So that's wonderful.
Great. So with trauma healing, I think you actually mentioned one of the great wonderful things and great challenges, which is trauma's everywhere. We can be doing everything. That's one of those challenges, figuring out where we should go, when we should go, and who and how, because there's no end. But maybe you can think of what are some of the other challenges that you're facing in trauma healing, you and all of the staff with SIM who are doing trauma healing facing these days?
Well, I think that the biggest challenge is the multiplication. And the way that you multiply is that you train leaders, and then as you train leaders, they do healing groups, but you want to mentor those facilitators and you want to mentor them well. And when there are so few trained facilitators and you're training many people, it's hard sometimes, it's difficult to figure out how do we mentor well. Right. And so going to their healing groups and participating, watching them lead a healing group, and then bringing them on board with us when we're doing healing groups and letting them share in our healing groups and in the experience of taking people is a good way, but it doesn't cover it all. So I think that that's one of the most difficult areas, is trying to figure out how do you mentor everyone and mentor them well. Yeah. I think that the other thing is just trying to collaborate with everyone. Sometimes people go into an area where there's already been trauma healing, there is trauma healing going on, and people walk in and they might think, oh, I'm the only one coming in here, I'm new to this area, when in fact there's been lots of people that have come in. And so I would just encourage people to collaborate. I know it's been my joy to collaborate with the Bible societies, and the Bible Society in the Congo, I was able to facilitate with Jean in the Congo, and in Uganda we collaborated with Bible Society, and so it's a blessing to collaborate with other organizations that are involved in trauma healing. It strengthens everybody's field, and it helps us all to grow, because we all can learn new techniques and new ways that will encourage. And I will say, one of the things that I've really learned is when we go into a new country, it's a blessing to have someone such as a Bible Society facilitator who knows their culture. Because as Westerners, we do not understand the total culture, but they do. And they are able to say to us, you know what, this is how we do it, or this is what we need to do, because this is what our culture is about. And I have really been blessed in being able to walk alongside those guys in different cultures, to be able to lean on them and say, okay, culturally, where should we go with this? And how should we handle this? I think that's a really important part, that we need to listen culturally to what's going on in the world, and not just as Westerners, we have all the answers.
Yeah, you're right. You're right, Nancy. And I've had conversations with folks that even folks within a particular region, sometimes they find that even if they're going not that many miles away, kilometers away, that it's really helpful to have a local person who understands that community and can help with the cultural translation, because even within our countries and our regions, we have these differences that are really essential for us to know and not trip over.
Yeah. Right. And I think it crosses even into different organizations.
Right.
I know that here in Liberia, we collaborate with Samaritan's Purse, and it's a blessing to be able to just work together and to be able to work with various different churches, and not being so siloed and insensitive to what else has been going on the field.
Sure. Excellent. You know, one of the things that struck me as you were talking about mentoring was the need to stay connected, you know. So I'd be curious, what different formats are you guys using, both in Liberia but across SIM and the various people you're working with, to stay connected so that you know what healing group facilitators are doing, for instance?
Right. WhatsApp is great.
Yeah. Everybody's best friend, right?
Right. I think that's been a huge, and just being able, texting is so common anymore, that being able to have facilitators send you a text from the DRC and send you pictures and say, here I am in my healing group. It's it's really a blessing to get things like that from around the world. And so I'm thankful for technology, even though sometimes it seems like it doesn't always work well, but
thank God it's working today. And other ways that you can get connected too, the Trauma Healing Institute actually has a Facebook page. And so if you are not connected on our Facebook page, you can click the link. Our tech team is going to put that in the chat box. We also have an Instagram page where you can follow along, and we feature all of our alliance partners. American Bible Society is one of them. SIM is one of them. And all of your stories. We want to hear from you. What are your stories, so that we can feature you in our Instagram and in our Facebook accounts as well. So those are some other ways that people can stay connected too.
That's great. And remember, of course, if you're going to post a picture, make sure you have permission of everybody in the picture to do that. But you can always do a selfie, and because we know you're giving permission of yourself, right? Where you're leading your group, because it's great for us to know what's happening. So I did want to ask you a question, Nancy, about self-care. Trauma is everywhere. We have a passion for it. We are excited to see people being able to tell their story and develop increasing resilience and able to help other people. And it does energize us. And yet, it is taking in a lot of pain. I'm curious about things that you have discovered along the way that help you stay strong and resilient and to take care of yourself, to know your limits, etc.
Yeah.
Well, I think the number one thing is I've learned that I have to set boundaries. That I know what my limit of hearing. When we first came back, because I was so overwhelmed with the stories that we were hearing in the hospital, that I decided I would try and do 3 different trauma healing groups a week, new groups. So we had approximately 36 to 40 people a week that we were listening to. And I remember when we got to the end of doing all those healing groups, I said, I know that I cannot do this again like this, because it was too much. You were listening, you were walking with people through very difficult issues. And when you live in a community and you're walking through them, they don't always go home. All of those issues don't always go home at night.
Yeah.
I mean, you're living with them in physical need and in various other needs, educational needs. And so I found that I had to set up boundaries. And then I also found out that one of the things that really has blessed me is that once a year, David and I take a very specific time to get away, just the 2 of us, and to enjoy God's beauty somewhere, to be able to rest and to enjoy one another and just debrief. And we debrief, and I debrief a lot with he and other facilitators. After each one of our trainings, we as facilitators sit down and debrief with one another, and that really helps. But setting boundaries and taking time to regroup has been really important. So,
Yeah.
That's helpful. That's helpful to know.
Yeah, Nancy, we actually have a question from the audience, and it's from a group of vets in the Survivors Clinic. And the question was, did you find that you were experiencing any survivor guilt? You survived, so many others did not. They didn't survive Ebola. And so did you have any guilt about that? And just how did you deal with that? And I think our facilitators can relate to that because they might not have experienced the same level of trauma that someone else would. So how do we deal with that?
Yes, I can say that not only did I deal with that, but many survivors dealt with that. I mean, we had survivors that their whole families died of Ebola, and they lost. I remember one of our survivors lost 16 members of their family. And her question kept being, why me? How did I survive? Why did I survive? And so there was survivor's guilt with that. One of the ways that I even experienced survivor's guilt was the fact that I was evacuated. I didn't end up having to be here the whole time. And so there was this guilt on the privilege of being taken care of in a Western hospital.
Wow.
Right.
Receiving everything I could possibly have been given and knowing what was happening here. And so at first I really struggled with that. And then I just had to really come to the place where I realized that God used it and it was part of God's plan and that this was his story. It's not my story, it's God's story. And he wanted to use it for his glory and for the greater benefit for trauma healing. And so it was hard, and it's been hard for people who have walked through that and have lived and others have not.
Yeah.
I hope that helps to answer. the question.
Yeah, to go along with that, there is another population that you mentioned once before in Liberia. These were people who were involved in helping to bury, I believe, or to deal with the dead, and that they had a special burden and probably a special guilt that they struggled with. Can you tell us a little bit about who they were and some of the efforts to help them?
Okay. So Liberia does not normally cremate. It's not part of our culture here in Liberia. But because the epidemic became such a huge issue, the president declared that bodies would be cremated. And there was a central location. There were health workers that went out and picked up the bodies, whether it was from a hospital, whether it was from homes. So they had men and women that went out and picked up the bodies and took them to this central location, then where they were cremated. So there were 33 men who were part of the cremation team. And there was a story that came out in the New York Times. And it was a story about these guys and how one of them, and he shared how the night that he leaned over and he picked up a body bag, and when he picked up the body bag, the name on it was his very good friend. And he said all of a sudden, the guilt and the pain of what they were doing was beyond what he could handle. He finished his job and he walked away, and he just walked out of there that night, not even being finished with his shift. Well, when I read this story, I felt this burden that we needed to reach out to them. And so our partner church, the Evangelical Church of Liberia, and SIM contacted them, and we invited them to come to our campus. We held a luncheon for them in honor of the work that they had done. And in this time that we were with them, we explained about trauma healing and asked them if they would like to be a part of a trauma healing group. And they responded to, yes, we need this. So we began a trauma healing group with the men, and it didn't go well because part of the problem was in dealing with cremation, the way that they were dealing with it was through drugs and alcohol. And starting through the healing group was not, they were not ready for it. So we stopped the healing group, and I really felt like we had failed. But they had my number, and we encouraged them that if they would like to reconsider doing a healing group, to call us. 1 year later, I received a phone call from one of the guys, and he said, "Sis Nancy," he said, told me who it was, and he said, "We're serious and we need trauma healing, and we want to know if you'll do trauma healing with us." Wow. So we started a healing group with them again. The men went through the trauma healing group, and I can say with joy that they completed the healing group. And I met with one of the guys even just this last week, and he had just completed graduating from a technical school. And
wow.
part of trauma healing is finding ways that people can become or get out of the trauma that they're struggling with, not only through trauma healing, but in an occupation, or if they've missed out. And he had missed out in education during the war. And so now he's able to come back in and be educated and walk away and hold his head high and have some tools with resilience and having gone through the trauma healing.
So that's so beautiful.
But you know, it's not just that 5-week or 6-week or 15-week time that we go through trauma healing. I mean, we're talking that this has been years that you sometimes walk with people in order to help them process the trauma.
Yeah. What I find amazing in this is the hope that gets built, because, you know, to go on to school and to graduate suggests you have a future. And that's really what's coming out when people start to find healing, is that they start thinking about not only can they help other people, but what is my life for? So that's a great story to maybe to end on here. We're getting ready to wrap up here in just a minute or two, but we're so grateful for the time that you have been able to give us some hope also about what God is doing in your little corner of the world there and in your life. So we're really grateful for that. Do we have any final questions or comments?
Yeah, thank you again so much, Nancy. We want to make sure that those of you that are viewing, if you have specific questions about events, coordinating materials, program questions, to email us at info@traumahealinginstitute.org. They'll put that in the chat bar as well, but any questions or comments or just sharing your story, a hard story, a great story about the work that you're doing in the trauma healing ministry, we want to hear from you. So Nancy, thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Again.
Thank you. It's really been a privilege to be with you. And I just want to encourage all of the facilitators that are listening today. Sometimes people get discouraged because, you know, they don't feel like their healing groups are not finding the people that they want for their healing groups, or they just get discouraged. And please don't give up. You know, this is God's ministry, and it's really his story and what he's doing through the lives of people. And I want to just, if I can just close with one verse out of Philippians.
Please, yes.
It's Philippians 4:8, and it says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, and whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received, heard and seen, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you." I just think that as we go through trauma healing, that when we can think about these things, even as we hear the difficult stories, that God is honored, and that his word comes true, that he really does give us his peace as we seek to help people that are really struggling and hurting. So thank you for allowing me this time to be with you. It's a privilege, and I praise God for trauma healing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, Nancy.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I needed that.
I know.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. I really needed that. Thank you so much for that scripture again. And thank you guys for joining us. The point of this whole program, the reason why you joined Trauma Healing, because you had a heart, you had a stirring in your heart to help people that were wounded. You saw people in your churches, in your communities, in your family, in yourself, that needed healing that only Christ could give, and you wanted to find a solution for that. And so you came to this program. And so we hope that from hearing this webinar that you would go out, you would be encouraged and inspired to lead a healing group. If you haven't done one, start one. If you've done several, do another one. Find a partner that you can lead your healing group with, because that's how people's hearts are going to get wounded. Listen well. You guys have the tools, and if you forgot what they were, go back to your materials or email us. Find your mentor. Go to your local Bible society or organization that you know that's doing trauma healing. There's a couple other action items we'd like you to walk away with. I think we have a slide for that. You will be receiving a survey. Once you log out of Zoom, you'll get a prompt. to fill out a survey. We want to hear how this experience was for you. So please fill out the survey so that we can hear from you. Again, lead a healing group. Let's see hearts healed in Jesus' name. And then again, follow us on our social media channels, whether that be Facebook or Instagram, so that you can stay connected. Again, we heard there was so much activity happening in the chat. We want that to continue to happen. And we know a lot of people are using social media to do that. So we want to enter into that space with you. I just want to say a blessing over you as you transition back into your homes, your ministry, wherever God is leading you today. We just want to pray that the Lord would bless you, that he would keep you, and that he would shine his face upon you and give you peace. We'll see you next time.